In this video, we'll look at how to set up one-time PIN, which is known as OTP, for React Native email verification from scratch. We are going to create the screens, implement the split inputs, and see how we can get everything to work by connecting it to a backend. I'm working with a login system codebase which we built on the channel, but you should still be able to set up the OTP verification by following this video to the end. I'll link to the full playlist at the end of the video and in the description. Starting with the main OTP verification page, we create a file for the page. All the pages in this project reside in the screens directory. In this file, we'll set up a component for the verification page. If you are working on a new React project, then you should be able to see the output of your work almost immediately. But for this project, we've made use of React navigation to set up navigation for the screens. So to see the output, we need to set the OTP verification screen as one of the screens. In the component, the first thing we want to return is the keyboard avoiding wrapper. This is a component that we created, and it makes use of the keyboard avoiding view and the touchable without feedback components from React Native to ensure that the virtual keyboard doesn't cover any input fields that we have on our page. In this component, we see that we are making a colors import from a styles file. This is because for all the styling in this project, we made use of styled components, so that we'll be able to create reusable components having the styles that we want. This file can be found in the components directory. We will need some of the components along the way, so I'll focus on the needed ones when we are using them, so that you can equally create them if you don't have them already. So in the OTP verification file, we make use of the keyboard avoiding wrapper after importing it from the components. In the wrapper, we will need a container, and we want to make use of the one in our styled components. This is basically a view with a flex of one and also some padding around the content. For the background color, it makes use of one of the colors we've defined above here. These are the colors that we've used in the project so far. Once we have that, we attach an additional style to align the items in it to the center. In the styled container will be two components to divide our page into two halves, a top and a bottom half. These are just equally sized views with a flex of one and have some spacing around the content. Over here in the styles file, we see an icon BG component, and this is the first component that we use on the page. It will be in the top half section. In the icon BG, which means icon background, we can first put our status bar in there and style it to be dark. In addition, we want to make use of oct icons to display an icon, and we'll get that from Expo vector icons. You don't need to install any package for this if you're on Expo. The icon will be the lock icon and we'll give it a size. For the color of the icon, we'll need a brown color from our colors, which means that we need to import our colors. In the bottom section, we first want to display a title, and we make use of the page title component. The page title component is a simple text with some font styling. The function you see here with the props argument is there to change the font size dynamically whenever the welcome property is received. The page title component will have account verification as the content. Now the size of the font is a bit huge, so I'll reduce it to 25 pixels. Right below the page title, we want to inform the user to enter the code. For this, we'll make use of the info text component. This is a regular text component with a color, a font size, and also has been centered. In the message, we want to display the email address which was used and put some emphasis on it. For now, we'll make use of a dummy email address. To put emphasis on the email address, we have a component called emphasize text. All it does is to make the text bold and italic. The next part of the screen will be the input fields. For that, we'll create a component for it and call it code input field. And in this component, we import React and set up a function component. Now on the verification page, we need to create some states for the code input. The first state variable will be code. This will store the value of the input field. The next one will be pin ready. This will be a boolean which will be true whenever our input field is full. Also, we create a constant which will store the preferred length of our code. With that in place, we'll pass the variables to the code input field. Now natively, it is not possible to implement split input fields in React Native. This is true at least at the time of recording this. So we need to implement a workaround to achieve the behavior that we want. So the workaround we are going to implement is that we are going to make use of one text input field, which will receive our code input. For each number that is inputted, we render a view with a border around it. While doing that, we hide the regular text input from the screen and make calls to it using a reference attribute. To start with the input field, let's create two styled components, one for the input section and another for the hidden text input. We give the section a flex and also center the content and give it some margin vertically. For the hidden text input, we will not style it for now, so that I'll be able to see the output of it. Back in the code input field, we import these two components and use them. Once we are done with that, we want to assign some properties to the hidden text input. We'll start with a reference, and for that we import the useRef hook from React. Using the hook, we'll create a variable with an initial value of null. Done with that, we assign the variable to the ref property of the text input. Also, we assign the code to the value and set code to the unchanged text property. For the onSubmit editing property, we want to create a handle on blur function. This function will be called when the input field loses focus. We will implement it later. We'll set the keyboard type to number pad and the return key type to done. Also, the text content type, we want to set it to one-time code. This only works on iOS, and it is used to indicate that the input field can be auto-filled by a code arriving in an SMS. Even though we are not using SMS in this episode, this is a good property to have. Lastly, we set the max length of the input field, which indicates the maximum number of digits that the input field will accept. Now we need a state variable, and we'll call it input container is focused. This will be a boolean with an initial state of false. Using the set method, we can set its value to false in the handle on blur function. So whenever the input field is selected and is in focus, we'll set this value to true. Next, we need a container for our split input, and we want to be able to press this, so make use of the pressable. This will take 70% of the screen size, and we want all the items in it to be in a row, hence the flex direction of row, and we want to have spaces between the items. In the input field, we import and use the container. This will expect an onPress property, and for the value, we'll create a handle onPress function. In this function, we'll first set the input container is focused to true. Right after that, we'll make use of the text input ref to trigger the focus function of the input field. This will cause it to be active and ready to accept some inputs. We make use of the question marks to avoid any undefined errors. Now back in our styles file, we'll create some more components. The first one will be code input, and this will be a view wrapping each digit of the input. We give it a border color of light green and a minimum width of 15%. We also give it a border width and a border radius, and some padding around its content. Also, for the actual text that will be in this view, we will give it a font size and also style it to be bold. We also align it to the center and give it a color. Now when a particular digit is in focus, we want to change the styling. So based on the code input, we'll create a code input focused, and this will have a border color of green, which is a deeper color compared to the light green color of the code input. Now to start, we will create an array with a length of the set maximum length and fill it with zeros. Now inside the code input container, we'll call the map method on the array we just created. The map method will expect a function which will be called for each item in the array. This function will receive the value and the current index of the array. Now we'll create a variable and call it empty input character. This will just be a white space. Also, we create a digit variable. The value of this will be fetched from the current value of the input field based on the current index. So if our current index is 0, it will fetch the value at the 0 index of the input field. Else if there is nothing there, we'll return our empty input character. Based on this, we can return the code input component and assign the index as the value of the key. Inside the code input, we'll use the code input text, and the content will be the digit variable. Now remember that we created two components for the code input, one which is focused and the other which is not. So we need to do some formatting to be able to use that. We start by checking for some conditions about the current value in the map. The first condition is if we have the current digit to be highlighted, and that will be true if the index is equal to the length of the code. And also we check whether it is the last digit, and that will be true if the index is equal to the maximum length minus 1. Also, to know whether the code is full, that is when we have all our digits, the code length must be equal to the maximum length. Now for a digit to be focused, it should be the current digit, or it is the last digit and the code is full. Now we'll create a new variable and call it styled code input. For the value, we'll first check whether the input container is focused, and if we have a digit focused. If that is true, we return the code input focused. Otherwise, we return the regular code input. Now replace the code input in the return section with the styled code input, and this should style the code inputs appropriately. Now whenever the code input reaches the maximum that we want to set the pin ready to true. And to do this, we'll make use of the useEffect hook. In the useEffect hook, we'll set the pin ready to the outcome of comparing the code length to the maximum length. For the cleanup function, we'll set pin ready to false. So whenever this component on mount, we'll set the pin ready to false. Also, we pass the value of the code as a second argument, so the isEffect hook will run whenever the value of the code changes. Now when we enter something into the input field, we see that the current ticket is highlighted, and we'll complete the section by hiding the actual input field. To do that, we'll position it to be absolute, give it a width and a height of 1 pixel, and change the opacity to 0. Now we need the submit button, and we'll make use of the styled button in our styled component. This button was created based on a touchable opacity. We also need the button text component, which will be the text in the styled button. Now back on the verification page, we import the styled button and the button text. In the button text, we'll put verify as the value. Also, we'll style the button a bit by changing the background color to green and also giving it a flex direction of row. In addition to the text, we want to put an icon, and we'll get the icon from Iron Icons. The icon will be the checkmark circle, and we'll give it a size and also a color. All the used colors will be imported from our colors. Now for the function which will be triggered when the button is pressed, we'll call it submit OTP verification. We will just declare the function and implement it later, and we'll pass it as the value to the onPressed property of the styled button. Now our button could be in 3 situations based on the state of the code input. The first is when the pin is ready and we should be able to send a request. So for that, we'll create another state to help us deal with that. The state will be called verifying, and it will be false by default. So when verifying is false and our pin is ready, we want to return this button that we've created. That is, we should be allowed to send the code to be verified. Next, if verify is false and the pin is not ready, we want to disable the button. So for that, we'll add a disabled property to the styled button. And also, we'll change the background color to light green. For the text, we'll change the color to gray as well. And we can get rid of the onPressed property. Next, if verifying is true, we ensure that the button is disabled and the content is changed to an activity indicator, which you can get from React Native. For the next section of the page, we want to provide a way for the user to request for a resend of the OTP. And also, we want to make use of a countdown timer to limit how often the user can send this request. But for this feature, we dedicated a whole episode to it, while implementing account verification using a verification link. So I'll quickly run through it, and you can check out the dedicated video after this to get the full understanding. So to start, we need to declare some states in the verification component. These states will be used by the timer. Next, we need a Resend Timer component, which you can create under the components directory. In the file, we'll create a Resend Timer component which returns a view. This component will expect to receive the states that we created as properties. Now we import some components from our styled components. For the info text, emphasize text and colors, we've used them already. For the inline group, it is just a view displaying centered items in a row with some padding around it. The text link also makes use of touchable opacity and just centers the content. The text link content is the text which will be used in the text link. This has a color and a font size. And also making use of the props, we check for the Resend status property. If it is filled, we adjust the color to red. Otherwise, we change the color to green. In the component itself, we first use the inline group in the view. This will display a text using the info text and will return the text link. We'll further style it to have an opacity of 0.5 depending on the value of active resend. The link will also be disabled whenever active resend is false. And for the onPressed property, we'll assign resend email to it, which we'll receive from the props. Inside the text link will be the text link content. This will receive the resend status as a property, and the value will be resend status. For the style, we'll change the text decoration line to underline, and the content will be the resend status as well. Now all this will be returned if the resending email is false. We'll make use of the text link again, but this time around, it will be totally disabled, and the content of the text link will be an activity indicator. For this, we'll return it whenever resending email is true. Right below that, we'll make use of the info text. It will display in and also the time left. For the time left, we'll wrap it with the emphasize text component, and the value will be the time left or fall back to the target time. Now all this will be displayed whenever active resend is false. Now back on the verification page, we import this resend timer. We then use it and pass the values to it as properties. For the resend email, it will be a function that we'll implement later on. Now to update the value of the state, we need some functions. The first function is calculate time left. This will take final time as an argument, and it will calculate the difference in time between the final time and the current time. If the difference is greater than 0, we'll set the difference as the time left, and we'll divide it by 1000 since the value is in milliseconds. Else, if that is not the case, we'll call clear interval and pass the resend timer interval to it. We'll assign it to an interval later on. And also we set active resend to true and time left to null. After that, we create a trigger timer function. This will trigger the timer to start. And this will receive a target time in seconds as an argument, and the default will be 30. In this function, we'll first set the target time to the received argument, and then we set active resend to false. Now we'll calculate the final time to be the current time plus the target time in seconds multiplied by 1000 to convert it to milliseconds. After that, we set an interval to call the calculate time left function and pass it the final time argument, which will be called every 1 second, and we'll assign the result to the resend timer interval. Now for a way to actually trigger this timer, we'll make use of the useEffect hook. So in the useEffect hook, we'll call the trigger timer, and for the cleanup function, we'll clear the interval, which is the resend timer interval. This should do it for the resend timer. Now the next thing we'll do is to set up some modal screens, which we'll use as responses when the user submits the code. To kick this off, we'll create some state variables for the modal. We will use modal visible to determine whether to display the modal or not. The verification successful will determine whether the request succeeded or there was an error. The request message will store whatever message that we receive from the request. Now in the components directory, we'll create a verification modal. In this file, we set up a verification modal component. We start by importing the status bar and also the modal from React Native. In addition, we import some of our styled components and go ahead to destructure some of the colors. Now we need some extra components. So in the styles directory, we start by creating a modal container. This will be based on the styled container that we've already used. But this time around, we'll center the content both horizontally and vertically, and we'll give it a background color as an RGBA black with an opacity of 0.7. We also create a modal view component, which will be a view, but I'll give it a lot more styling, which all it does is to give it a background color of white, a margin, a padding, a border radius, and also give it some shadow. All the shadow properties will have an effect only on iOS. The elevation property here will do the equivalent of that on Android. Now back in the verification modal, we add that to the input. Now in the verification modal component, we destructure some properties that we'll be expecting. Majority of them will be from the state that we created. Now the last property, which is persist login after OTP verification, will be a function that you're expecting to run if the request was successful. In the function, we return the modal, and this will have an animation type of slide. This property will determine how the modal will show up. It can have a value of slide, fade, or none. We also assign the modal visible value to the visible property, and also we'll give it a transparent value of true. Inside this, we'll make use of the modal container. Now for the content of this modal container, let's create two more functions, but we'll create them outside the verification modal function. The first one will be success content. This will be a function expecting to receive a button handler. In the function, it will first return a modal view. To keep things consistent across board, we'll make use of our status bar here and style it to be dark. Right below that, we'll make use of an icon from Iron Icons. This will be the checkmark circle icon. We'll give it a size of 100 and a color of green. Before we proceed, let's put the success content in the modal container and go back to the verification screen and import the verification modal. Now we'll use the verification modal component and pass the state variables to it. For the property with the very long name, we'll just declare a function for that and implement it later. Now to see the output of the modal, we'll change the initial value of the modal visible to true. I only hope we don't forget to change it back to false when we are done. Now continuing with the success content, the next thing we'll return is the page title. We'll style it further by changing the font size, the color, and giving it a margin at the bottom. The content of it will be verified. The next one will be the info text, and this will also have a margin at the bottom of 15, and we'll just say that, yay, you have successfully verified your account. This is funny. Next, we'll use the styled button, and we'll change the background color to green, and also the flex direction to row. This will have an onPress property which will accept the button handler. In the button, we'll make use of the button text to display continue to up. Now we use Iron Icons once again to display the arrow forest circle icon. The size will be 25 and we'll give it a color of primary. Now we'll do a similar thing once again, so we'll copy and paste the whole thing. This time around, we'll call it fill content. In addition to the button handler, it will accept an error message. Now we can change the success content to filled content. Now starting with the first Iron Icon, we'll change the name to closed circle and the color to red. With the page title, the content will be filled. And for the info text, we'll make use of the string literals to display "Oops, account verification failed" and concatenate it with the error message. For the button, we'll change the background color to red. And for the content of the text, we'll change it to "Try again." Now for the icon, we'll change it to arrow radio circle. Now back in the modal container, we want to toggle these two components based on the value of successful. So if successful is false, we want to return the failed content, and then we pass the button handler and the error message. For the button handler, we'll create a quick function for it. In this function, if successful is true, we want to call the persist login after OTP verification function. This is the function we receive as a property. After that, we want to set modal visible to false. So in this case, if successful is false, it will just call set modal visible to false. Now in the modal container, if successful is true, we want to return the success content, but this will just accept the button handler. Now back on the verification page, I didn't forget. I have to change the modal visible back to false. Now we are at the point where we need to connect this to a backend so that we can test it out. I'll make use of a Node.js backend here which has already been deployed. If possible, we'll look at how to implement the OTP feature for the backend in the next episode. Let me know if that's something you would like to see. Now to start the integration, we'll need an API client, and throughout this project, we've been using Axios. So we import Axios from Axios. Next, we need the API endpoint for our backend, and for that I've stored mine in a shared file, so I'll import it from there. Next, for persisting data in the application, we'll be making use of async storage, so we import that. In addition to the async storage, we'll be making use of context to store our credentials, so we import that. Now at least for this project, the verification process starts with a sign up, so we move to the sign up page and start the integration from there. So in the function that handles sign up, we'll first change the function to an async one. Now after making the sign up request, we see that we check for a pending status. This is the nature of our backend. It returns a pending status after sign up. So if we don't get a pending status, we return a message. Otherwise, we want to move to the verification page with the data that we received. Now before we move to the verification page, we want to persist the data temporarily. So we create a function to help us do that. We'll call this function temporary user persist. This will be an async function and to accept the credentials. The credentials being the data that the user signed up with. In this function, we'll open a try catch block, and in the try block, we'll call async storage to store our data under the key temp user. For the value, we'll convert it to a string using JSON.stringify. In the catch block, we make use of the handle message to display an error message. Back in the handle sign up, we'll call temporary persist and destructure the data that we need from the credentials. We have to ensure that we do this before we navigate to the verification screen. Now back on the verification page, we implement our submit function. In this, we'll open a try catch block. The first thing we'll do is to set verifying to true. That is, whenever we enter this function, we'll be in the process of verifying the code input. After that, we'll create our URL by concatenating the base API URL with the appropriate endpoint for verifying the OTP. Once you have that, we call the post method on Axios, pass it the URL, and also the second argument will be an object of data. And in this object, we need to pass the OTP value and the user ID. But for the user ID, it is part of the data that we pass while navigating from the sign up page to the verification screen. So to be able to receive that, we need to destructure that from the route. So for the verification function, we'll first destructure the route from the params, and we'll have to destructure the user ID and also the email from the route.params. Now this might lead to some issues because we are currently on the verification page and we didn't pass any data while moving to this page. If that's the case, we can quickly go to the stack navigator and change the order of the screens, making sure that the verification screen is the last one. Now back on the verification page, we scroll down to the info text just below the page title, and we'll make the email there dynamic by replacing it with the email we just destructured. Back in the submit function, we pass the user ID and assign everything to a result variable. Now from the result, we destructure data. Now targeting status on data, we check if the value is verified. If it is not, we want to set verification successful to false, and then we'll set the request message to the data.message. Else if it is true, we want to set verification successful to true. After everything, we want to set modal visible to true and set verifying to false since we are done verifying. Now in the catch block, we'll set the request message based on the error, and we'll set verification successful to false since we only enter this block if there is an error. and also we set modal visible to true, and lastly we set verifying to false. Now for the resending email, the first thing we do is to set resending email to true. After that, we set up our URL to target the resend OTP verification endpoint. After that, we open a try catch block, and in the try block, we make a post request to the URL. As the data, we pass the email and the user ID, and after that, we set resend status to sent. But if there is an error, we'll handle it in the catch block, and for that, we set resend status to failed, and we can just alert an error message. After the try catch block, we will set resending email to false since you are done resending it, and we'll hold on briefly before we start the countdown timer, which we will do by using the set timeout function. This will take a function as an argument, and in the function, we will set resend status back to resend, and we'll set active resend to false, and we'll call the trigger timer function. For the timeout duration, we'll set it to 5 seconds. Now for the last function we need to implement, we need to bring in the use context hook. Once we have that, we destructure the stored credentials and the function to set the credentials from the credentials context that we imported earlier. Now in the persist login function, we open a try catch block. In the try, we first attempt to fetch the temporary data user that we saved. After that, we make use of resend storage once again to store the temporary user under the actual key that we want. After that, we can store the data in our credentials context, but this time around, we need to pass it using JSON. In the catch block, we can just select a message, and if you want, you can concatenate the actual error message to it. Sometimes I prefer not to use the actual error message because it might contain some technical information that your client might not understand. At this point, let's observe what happens when you sign up with some raw credentials. On sign up, we are sent an email with a PIN which you can enter to verify the account. A wrong PIN triggers the fail modal, and the correct PIN triggers the success modal, which has a button that we can click to persist the user in the app. The link to the full source code will be in the description below, and for the OTP backend that we used, we'll consider it in the next episode. Also, you can check out the full playlist to see how we got to this point in the app. Thanks for watching.